2003 was, in many ways, a great year for Formula One. After a couple of years of Ferrari dominance, suddenly the title fight looked blown wide open with as many as 4 drivers across 3 different teams looking like they could get their hands on the championship trophy. Through the 2003 season, 8 different drivers across 5 different teams took race wins, and we saw the debut wins of some young up-and-comers, Kimi Raikkonen and Fernando Alonso. Whatever happened to them? Part of the reason for this more open, unpredictable title fight was the Tyre War between Bridgestone and Michelin. Bridgestone had been supplying tyres to Formula One since 1997, but French manufacturer Michelin joined the sport in 2001, and by 2003 was supplying half the grid. At the top end of the grid, Bridgestone were well bedded in with Ferrari, while rivals McLaren and Williams chose to partner with Michelin, wary of the close relationship between Ferrari and the Japanese tyre firm. 2003 really saw Michelin get into their stride. While they had won races with Williams and later McLaren across their first 2 seasons, 2001 and 2002, were categorised by the total domination of Ferrari and Michael Schumacher, with the team winning 20 out of the 34 races. A hit rate of 59%, which, and you'll have to trust me on this, was a lot for the time. Frustratingly so. 2003, however, was a different story. There were only 16 rounds that season and we didn't quite have the same kind of summer break as we do now, but after Hungary there was a 3-week gap before the final 3 rounds of the year. Imagine, only 3 rounds left after Hungary. At this point, the championship was poised for a showdown with 3 drivers from 3 different teams separated by just 2 points. But then, during the summer break, events transpired to make it all fall flat on its face and make a passing glass at 2003 look like just one of the many stepping stones in Schumacher's 5 titles in a row. But how did we get to such a situation? Well, 2003 turned out to be a very different year from those before it. Ferrari didn't win any of the first 3 races. In fact, they only got a single podium in Malaysia with Rubens Barrichello. McLaren won the first 2 races, with Giancarlo Fisichella scoring a rare victory for Jordan in the 3rd round at a chaotic rain-hit Brazilian Grand Prix that fell foul of the bizarre rule that only allowed for one type of wet weather tyre. Schumacher hit back hard by winning the next 3 races on the bounce, twice in difficult circumstances. He won in San Marino despite losing his mother the previous day and came through to win the Austrian Grand Prix despite losing time in a pit stop due to a fuel fire. But then, Schumacher only won 1 of the next 7 races, the Canadian Grand Prix. The heatwave sweeping through Europe that year had really favoured the Michelin teams, whose tyres seemed to thrive better in hot track conditions. In fact, Michelin were really starting to show up the recently mighty Ferrari. While Rubens Barrichello did grab victory for the Italian team with a jaw-dropping drive in a crazy British Grand Prix, Schumacher only scored a single podium between his Canadian victory and the Hungarian Grand Prix, scoring a 5th, a 3rd, a 4th, a 7th, and then an 8th in Hungary for a single point. This was not a great run for a title contender, let alone a 5 times world champion. And while Schumacher scraped a lonely point at the Hungaroring, a very young upstart named Fernando Alonso dominated from pole to flag, taking his first victory. The form book, it seemed, was truly shredded this year. By the time the flag fell in Hungary, Williams were leading the Constructors' Championship, and in the 10 races since F1 started its European leg, the Michelin teams had outscored the Bridgestone squads 2-1. The championship stood with Schumacher on 72 points, Juan Pablo Montoya in the Williams on 71 points, and Kimi Raikkonen in his McLaren on 70 points. And McLaren was just using an updated version of its 2002 car, with the 2003 model infamously never getting out of R&D stage. Now, while some of this was down to the ongoing tyre war that gave Michelin teams a heavy boost through the hot European summer, it's worth pointing out that 2003 was operating under a revamped point system that had heavily reduced the gap between 1st and 2nd place, while extending the points down to 8th. This was aimed at keeping the title a little closer, even if one driver was excessively dominating, as Schumacher had been doing recently. So consistency was overly rewarded, hence why the title fight was so close despite Schumacher bagging far more wins than his rivals. Anyway, after Hungary, Bridgestone may have casually mentioned to Ferrari that they had made some observations about the behaviour of the Michelin tyres. See, part of the regulation around tyres is that there is a defined maximum tread width. That is, the part of the tyre designed to make contact with the track can only be so wide. This is something measured before the race by the FIA. Bridgestone had noted scuff marks on the sidewalls of the Michelin tyres, suggesting that, under race conditions, their tyres could deform to allow more of their rubber to touch the track and offer better grip consistency. Having a bigger contact area with the track allows the rubber to work the energy, heat and associated degradation a little better, so the tyre can hold its grip and consistency for longer and would have to be less managed. What transpired is that Michelin's sidewalls were constructed in a way that was less stiff than Bridgestone's, and consequently they tended to roll a little through the corners in the way that the Bridgestone tyres did not. Now it's unclear if the Michelin tyres ever really had more than the maximum amount of tyre down at any one point, or whether, in the rubber rolling under lateral forces, more rubber was laid down on one edge, while corresponding rubber was lifted from the opposite edge. Nonetheless, the FIA made immediate clarification to the rules between Hungary and Italy, stating that all tyres would be inspected and measured after races for evidence of where the tyres had regular and systematic contact with the track. Rather than risk running afoul of the slightly grey area of the FIA's clarification, Michelin immediately worked to change the construction of their tyres ready for the Italian Grand Prix, which was quite an impressive feat. I'll leave it to you to decide if this was fair or not, but Michelin argued that their construction had been the same throughout their whole time in Formula 1 since 2001 and had been repeatedly checked by the FIA, so they and their teams were more than a little annoyed. Ultimately, this destabilised the campaigns of McLaren and Williams. As the suspension of Formula 1 cars is heavily tied into the behaviour of the tyres, suddenly the Michelin teams had to change the way that they were able to set up their cars. Tyre pressures, toe-in, camber, stiffness, all of it had to be re-evaluated in light of the new, stiffer tyres, and it did not work well with their car designs. And so Ferrari won the last 3 races of the season and became double world champions for the 4th time running, with Schumacher sealing his title by 2 points with a very clumsy 8th place in the final round. A bit of a deflated and frustrating end to those of us waiting to see an epic 3-way fight to the bitter end. Was this fair? It's tricky for me to say, but it did give Michelin a tremendous amount of work to do with almost no time. Bearing in mind that Pirelli give teams an 8-week deadline to nominate their tyres for European races and a 14-week deadline for flyaways just so their logistics are manageable, 3 weeks to create and produce a new tyre construction for half the grid is astonishing. It is somewhat unusual for a rule like this to come in so quickly. Nowadays you expect this rule tidying to be done between seasons. Nevertheless, what we saw in 2003 was a clear consequence that comes out of having a tyre war run rampant in Formula 1. Lots of people are eager for multiple tyre manufacturers to come in and shake up the sport, but this potential solution comes with a lot of its own problems. For example, in 2003's case, half the field can be put at a massive disadvantage. It doesn't even have to be through tricky inter-team sniping and snitching either. If one tyre supplier goes in the wrong way in their philosophy, it'll take down all its teams with them. We've seen similar things with power units in recent years, with Renault and Honda struggling to keep up with their rivals and potentially holding former champions McLaren, Red Bull and Renault itself back. Check out the video on the complete failure of Michelin during the 2005 US Grand Prix for an even more acute example of this. An upside of the tyre war seen in 2003 was that it managed to quell Ferrari's recent dominant streak. Sure, they still wrapped up both titles that year, but their somewhat huge advantage was restrained by Michelin's strength on track. Michelin allowed McLaren and Williams to bring the fight to Ferrari, something those hoping for anything to break Mercedes' crushing performance might wish for. The immediate flip side of that becomes obvious quite quickly though. The tyre suppliers will focus massively on those at the front of the grid. Bridgestone really was making their tyres specifically for Ferrari, and its other partner teams just had to work with what they were given. Strategically, this did make sense for Bridgestone, who wanted to be seen to be winning, but it did no favours to its other teams, who mostly ended up jumping ship to Michelin as time went on. But even Michelin had to focus on Williams and McLaren and later Renault, which left smaller teams more than a little disgruntled. We also have to consider the cost of a tyre war. With such furious competition between suppliers, tyres would start being made bespoke to each circuit. I mean, sure, they could be frozen at the beginning of each season, but it's a surprisingly tricky thing to scrutinise. Not that I'm ever assuming any tyre manufacturers would dream of pushing the boundaries of the rules in the name of competition. If tyre construction was largely frozen at the start of the year, we could indeed have the balance of power swing back and forth between different tyres race on race. In the same way that some cars favour fast corners and some favour the wiggly bits, a variety in tyre suppliers could add that dimension to the mix. On the other hand, one supplier could just muck it up one year and all its otherwise perfectly win-worthy teams are left struggling to get to the podium. Imagine if Mercedes got the best tyre on top of everything else right now. And you know it would spend a lot of time working with its tyre partner on getting it just right. The truth is, the tyre is the sole point of contact between the car and the track and therefore determines a lot about how the car will perform. In using a single tyre supplier, Formula 1 is able to make certain demands of how it wants to go racing and control that through the tyre. With a tyre war in place, there's no control over how warring suppliers choose to push their performance, which won't necessarily result in anything better on track. Sure, lap times will come down, but that will only encourage the FIA to reduce speeds in other parts of the car. Smaller engines, spec wings, they'll find a way. So, tyre wars, much like refuelling, comes with pros and cons, and definitely aren't the be-all end-all of improving the sport or sustaining competition. How do you feel about the idea of more tyre suppliers joining Formula 1? Are you willing to take on the risks, or do you think we should focus more on just getting Pirelli to hone what we already have? Or perhaps you wish the sport would stop focusing on tyres so much? Either way, Let us know.